question is that this bill be now agreed to in principle. I call the member for Balmain.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you very much. Mr Deputy Speaker, today we have an extraordinary bill before this House. A bill that will in effect overturn the democratic decision that was made just over 1 year ago by the people of the electorate of Sydney. And it will do what the coalition parties could never do at the ballot box, which is ensure that the member for Sydney is not able to proceed with her role as a member for Sydney and the Lord Mayor of Sydney as determined by the voters in the election. In my view, and in the view of the Greens, who will strongly oppose this both here and in the other place, it strikes at the heart of what democracy means. The matter here, Mr Deputy Speaker, is clear. The democratic rights of the people of New South Wales must be respected, and the bill, in fact, represents a significant amount of political interference in the democratic process and must be strongly opposed. Now, we Greens are often in dispute with Labor Party, Liberal Party and Independents. And in fact, we compete against the Mayor of the City of Sydney and in the seat of Sydney against the incumbent in the election. But we respect the outcome of that ballot, but not this government. This government will not respect the outcome of that ballot. They will seek to interfere in the results of that election and ensure that they will decide who represents the local community, not the local voters. Now, the government has said the legislation is not aimed at Clover Moore. It's not aimed at Clover Moore. But of course, we can see that the government knows, and the effect of this bill is directly an attack on the member for Sydney, but more importantly, the voting community in the electorate of Sydney. Now, the member of Sydney has served in this place continuously since 1988, and in 2004 the member was popularly elected as Lord Mayor, then re-elected in 2008. And we know that the voters have chosen the member for Sydney to hold the role of Lord Mayor for 4 separate occasions, not secretly taken to the electorate, but fully disclosed. The members of the electorate realise that the member for Sydney has been totally transparent in the election, and it was only a little over a year ago that the candidate was the Mayor and they voted for her in a vote of very strong confidence. That should be respected. Now, here we see the Liberal National Coalition seeking to overturn that decision, the democratic right of the voters, in one autocratic swoop. It's another example of this government pushing an agenda which they did not take to the election previously. And if the government had such a small mandate and they had such a small amount of business to get on with after 16 years of Labor, I can understand why they would try and bring a bill forward like this. But the fact is there is an incredible amount of work to be done, and the fact that we are wasting the time of this parliament not delivering on public transport, on the environment, on health issues, and instead trying to knock out a member of parliament that was elected is an absolute disgrace. I wanted just to address a few of the flimsy arguments which have been bandied about. One, there is a potential conflict of interest. Well, first of all, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what conflict of interest means. We know that a conflict of interest is where an individual or a corporation is in a position to exploit their professional or their official capacity in some way for personal or corporate benefit. There is no conflict of interest here. In fact, there's one interest. There's one interest, and that's the interest of the people of the seat of Sydney. And that is what's being conflicted by this bill, not by the role of the member for Sydney. And if, as we've heard before, the government was serious about conflicts of interest, why doesn't the government tackle the issue of directorships? Why don't they tackle that issue? If they say the member has a conflict, what about the issue of directorships? What about the fact that MPs under these government spurious claims are to be full-time, yet people can be the directors of 6 companies, 7 companies, up to 8 companies MPs can be the directors, and that's not seen as a conflict. And we've also seen the role of Joanna Gash and the approach that this government is taking to make sure that they can try and parachute their federal member into a mayor in a local community, but they don't seek to apply the same rules to that situation. They only apply it here. And why? Because they want to jump on the bandwagon of the shock jocks and the right-wing press, the News Limited, Sunday Telegraph and Daily Telegraph angle. They want to follow the disingenuous attacks on things like cycleways, claiming that it's interfering in traffic. One lane's never been taken for a cycleway that's had traffic on it. Sure, lots of parked cars, but never traffic. And they want to jump on that bandwagon and they think, well, knock the member for Sydney out and we'll be better for it. Well, this is a classic example of overreach by this government and it should be opposed. We've also heard the state member being a local mayor or councillor, there's no one for the resident to complain to. Well, what a load of rubbish. They can complain to the member for Drummoyne, because in the member for Drummoyne's contribution, he spoke about someone complaining to him about the issue. You can complain to other councillors on that council, you can complain to the General Manager, you can complain to the Ombudsman, you can complain to the Department of Local Government, you can complain to other MPs. There's a whole raft of things that one can do to make sure that they're heard in the community. And that argument is the thin and flimsy joke which this bill is founded on. We've also heard that it's not practical in terms of a workload. Whilst it may be the case that holding two roles will carry a heavy burden, it doesn't then follow, well, we ban them from doing it. We ban them from doing it. Even though backbenchers can take roles as ministers or premiers, and we find that acceptable, but a member taking on a synergistic role as the mayor of a popularly elected role as a council seems to be not appropriate according to this government. And even if the government was uncomfortable with it, even if they were, the people of the electorate of Sydney voted to return her to both offices overwhelmingly and repeatedly. And that is why this should be supported, this approach that the member for Sydney has taken and those on this side, and while the government's thinly veiled attempts to knock out a popular MP should be resisted. Now, the arguments here we've seen today seem to imply that voters just don't understand the nature of state and local government, that the people are silly, the representatives, they've got no idea, they don't know, and therefore we'll pat them on the head and knock an MP out against the wishes of the people because of that. But the voters in the seat of Sydney know, and that's why they voted for the member for Sydney. And the electors, if they choose the same person for both jobs, it's a decision we must defend, because it has been the nature of this democracy in New South Wales since 1856. It's not up to the Premier to overturn this long-held right, and it's not up to anybody else, it is up to the voters. In conclusion, Madam Temporary Speaker, I draw the government's attention to the fact that a by-election will cost probably in excess of $300,000. Now, $300,000 for a by-election is a nonsense when we have communities struggling under the weight of costs, when we have poor infrastructure, we have community groups, we have residents in my electorate who need significant repair to their public housing dwellings, yet this government's prepared to pour $300,000 down the drain for a by-election when the people of Sydney spoke just 12 months ago, to elect the member for Sydney. And when the government overreached on the solar bonus scheme, many of you remember, and they overreached on the foster care issue, the government changed its position. This now is an opportunity for this Premier to recognise he is overreaching, that he is overreaching to attack the democratic nature of our local community and our state. And it's up to him to listen to the community and hear the view that this dictatorial overreach should not proceed and should be refused. And if they are serious, as the member for Northern Tableland said, about not impacting on the member for Sydney, they should exempt the current parliament from this bill, very simply, but they won't do that. And why won't they? Because they want to target the member for Sydney, and that demonstrates how effective she has been in organising her community and working in the electorate of Sydney and of the City of Sydney. So I'll finish this by saying that what this is very clearly and very openly an attack on independent voices, as evidenced by how effective, as I've mentioned, the Mayor has been and the member for Sydney in those roles. We oppose this bill. There is no conflict of interest. There is adequate time for an MP to perform both roles. There is clearly a measure of very strong support given to this member by the community. And even if you agree with every argument, every flimsy argument that the coalition parties have put forward, you should respect the will of the people. And this, I fear, is the beginning of a very treacherous path this government is taking. Because if you don't respect the will of the people, if you think the voters are ignorant and ill-informed, that is the beginning of the arrogance that tips governments out. So I call on this House to refuse this bill and vote to support the wishes of the members of the community in the electorate of Sydney.
The question is